So met Sergey and Larry before they started, as they were starting Google, got to meet a lot of folks who were seeing huge success, way beyond what we had access to or exposed. And the thing that struck me was, even with all their wealth and success that they already had at that young age, they were more interested in social issues and global issues. And so I thought, why can't I just work on that now? Technology, I think, offers so much opportunity to address those issues. I don't really like, and they weren't happier. If anything, they were, not to say tortured, but like they were more excited, more enthusiastic, having created some really cool tech projects like with Bill Gates and making a social impact. And so I thought, maybe I can just jump and do that now. I don't really need to go and make tens of millions or billions of dollars. I think my skills are needed in this sector now. And even today, the nonprofit and charitable sector has scarce technology resources dedicated to its success and survival. And I think we need more than ever, given how the issues that we're trying to address are bigger than ever, and the forces we're up against in terms of, like you talked about, social media addiction and mental health issues and education, competitiveness globally. They need a strong nonprofit sector that has the best tools at its disposal.
There are some people that and I don't say this about a lot of people, but that just strike you as impressive. That would be the word I would use to describe Michael Furdyk. Michael is somebody that has been on my radar that I've known. I mean, I'm going back now probably 15 years. And at the time, he's still a young guy, I think, and he was a really young guy then, who had this entrepreneurial spirit and passion. And my first encounters with him, I knew he was doing something with global classrooms and things of that nature. But as I've got to know more about him, his organization, his partner Jennifer, I just look at them and say, wow, this is one impressive young man. And impressive from the standpoint that he has, and Jennifer, his partner, have, and by the way, shout out to Connected North, my hoodie here. Thank you, Jennifer and Michael, have maintained a commitment to kids and to education in a nonprofit capacity for 25 or so years. That is impressive. I mean, we don't see that very often. And so I watch how he's done that, and the way in which he has always, in all of his every conversation I've ever had with him over the years, there is a clear priority of, let's do some stuff for kids. Let's do right by kids. And having a chance to sit down with Michael and getting a little bit more of the details around his story and his journey was a real privilege for me. And I'm grateful to be able to point to him as a fellow Canadian doing really important work in education and being a leader in so many capacities. So enjoy my conversation today with Michael Furdyk. All right, Michael, where do we find you today at this moment in time?
At this moment in time, I am here in Montreal, about to attend the Indigenous AI conference at Mila tomorrow and Wednesday.
So you get around. There's no question about that. We're going to talk a little bit about your some of the organizations that you've helped develop. But as we prep to hit record button, you told me that you were just in Geneva. And tell us a little bit about what you were doing there and just your experience there.
Yeah, so back in 2003, the United Nations hosted two summits, 2003 and 2005, called the World Summits on the Information Society. And these were held originally at the inspiration of actually the country Tunisia. So they hosted one of those two summits. And the idea was to think about, they were seeing the internet coming into being, and they were worried, the United Nations was concerned, I think, that many countries would miss out on this revolution of ICTs, information and communication technology, if we didn't intentionally create policies and funding and opportunities to ensure that less developed countries had access to technology and opportunities. And so that was just after Jennifer and I started Taking It Global, and we were invited to participate and inspired by meeting a number of other young people from other countries who were there as well, to start what became one of the first official youth caucuses, a group of youth. There were all these different, there was a women's caucus, and there were all these different official groups, but there wasn't anyone organizing youth to participate. And so it was the first time at a UN summit where youth had that official representation. And we probably had 40 or 50 young people from around the world that were participating, accredited, and advocating for funding. And it ended up in 2005 that we funded an intern at the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva. And the Canadian government and the Fijian government supported a paragraph, a youth paragraph, that made it into what was called the Declaration of Principles of this UN conference, which meant that informed and guided the funding and the kind of commitments that countries around the world made to increase access to technology for young people over the last 2 decades. So this was the WSIS Plus 20 Summit, where countries were coming back together. And this year, this fall, countries around the world are going to be reporting on what they've done to meet these commitments to the World Summit on the Information Society kind of process. Surprisingly, Canada didn't have the leadership role that we hoped and expected them to have, but there was a huge amount of progress made by many other countries. And what was especially inspiring was that there were many young people there integrated into the official conference with a voice, with a role. Back then, 20 years ago, we were very much on the fringes, not in the main room. We had a tiny little exhibit that we furnished by going to the IKEA that I saw at the airport because we didn't have the money. We returned the furniture for our booth after the conference back then. So it's amazing to see 20 years later how far technology's come. Like I was saying to you before that we started recording, Geneva felt so complex and bizarre on my first trip 20 years ago because there was no iPhone, there was no maps, there was no data roaming. It's amazing now how seamless everything is as a traveler with the data and the connectivity that many are lucky to have access to.
I mean, there's so much there. There's many pieces to that. The one thing because it struck me as you mentioned where Canada stood 20 years ago and where it stands today. But in terms of the impact in these kinds of situations, how much of that do you think our lack of progress, if you will, could be related to the fact that we are provincially based in terms of our education, K-12 education? Do you think that plays a role that because you're one of the few people who tries to work across the country and remove the provincial barriers, but how much of the challenges, when you look at other countries in particular and maybe progress they've made in this area, do you think that is a barrier? Maybe it isn't.
I think it probably is a little bit of a barrier because at these kind of conferences and events, it tends to be national level representatives. I mean, we've had ambassadors, we have ministers there, but there wasn't really any sub-federal participation. There weren't provinces. It's that leadership at the government level. And so the fact that there is no minister of education nationally, or there isn't that leadership participating, advocating for at a global level, I think part of it is that funding has been so chiseled away that the idea of international travel, the idea of any travel at all, is seen as a luxury and not a necessity, not as important to share and establish our leadership role, but is scrutinized like any international travel, even in some of the funding that we have. Any travel outside of Canada is either not eligible for funding or has to go through a lot of approval. So I think we're missing out in sharing our practices and learning from other countries. There was a huge amount of inspiration I got from seeing ministers in other countries talk about how this year every student is going to receive AI literacy education in a country in Europe, or people wanting to bring our programs to their country. I think we're missing out by not either having that federal representation or not funding in our provinces those kind of international knowledge exchange. I think we probably have a lot more to learn from other countries and regions than we do between our provinces because we're quite similar in many ways.
That's right. No, I 100% agree. I think we definitely undervalue the ability and the opportunities that exist to learn from others, especially others that have a very different context with us, and to be able to not necessarily. I mean, we've been talking a long time. Finland has always had its sort of elevated status in terms of everyone looks there, and again. Wise people don't say, well, let's just do what they do. Wise people say, let's understand what they do and see how that might fit in to our context and our situation, not identically, but in terms of the principles that they're adopting. But I also want to just When you think back, it's hard, right? I mean, when you're there in 2003 or whatever, and you think about, yes, the advancement of technology is like mind blowing in many respects. And yet, if you were to think back to some of the maybe the goals and the sort of the hopes that people had at that time, how would you characterize technology itself has gone like this, but in terms of the actual impact that it's had that was promised at that, how do you juxtaposition those two timelines?
Yeah, I think as you said, the technology growth curve as measured by the speed of the processing units in our phone and even access to bandwidth largely has grown, especially in the last couple of years, and become universal. I think where we've lagged behind, especially in Canada, is in funding, especially in the nonprofit and charitable sector, innovations and initiatives that take advantage of that technology for the benefit of society. There was a prize, the WSIS prize, that was awarded to top projects around the world, demonstrating integration of technology for health, for education, for all these kind of elements. And we were honored to be recognized. Connected North is one of these WSIS Prize champions, 90 around the world out of almost 1,000 projects submitted. And we were the only Canadian initiative out of those 90. Whereas you had other countries with multiple submissions, innovations being shared, digitizing different elements of government, of healthcare, of training and society. And so I think that there's different levels of investment. I think largely in North America, I think Canada and the US are a bit similar in the sense we've left it up to the private sector to use technology, exploit it, figure it out. I think the challenge is that means people have gravitated towards the most like commercially lucrative things, not necessarily the most socially lucrative things. So I have a family member that spent many years working for one of the big five tech companies, and I was commenting to them that you have these people who are like the top of their field, the smartest people in the world that are hired at your company, and they're dedicating their lives to like optimizing advertising algorithms. Is that really the best we can do in terms of like moving forward our society? So I was encouraged to see so many other countries and other regions moving forward on these SDGs. And I feel like when I say SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I
Right.
still think in North America, you'd be hard pressed if you asked the average student, the average teacher, most people couldn't probably name more than one or two of the SDGs. Whereas in many other countries, especially in Asia and Europe, you have entire education systems, cross government initiatives. Even flight attendants, one of the Asian airlines I flew a couple months ago was wearing an SDG pin. I mean, I think there's broader awareness of the importance of investing in equality and social issues and causes. And in North America, I feel like I think we may be leaving too much up to commercial interests.
And do you think that's gotten progressively, I guess the word is worse, in the last 20 years? Whereas maybe there was some early beliefs that we should be focusing on what's best for society, and now everything is much more economically driven. Is that fair, do you think, from your perspective? Because you have this, I think you have a perspective that many don't have. Like, I feel like I'm pretty good about understanding Canada, but you understand this more in a global context. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
I do. And I think one of the things that's happened is, again, we've like largely invested in our post-secondary institutions. There have been so many initiatives and a lot of funding and a lot of successful groups and accelerators and incubators at that kind of post-secondary level that are trying to produce like the next BlackBerry. That's what they were producing. Now we're talking about the next
Sure.
Shopify. We've got a very small number of valuable tech companies, and that's I know how the government is defining like who's going to create that future employment and opportunity. But I think that because of how education is funded provincially, there's very few. CanCode is the one initiative that we're a part of from the federal government, and it's been great to see that leadership in terms of how do we build digital skills and now AI literacy across our schools. But largely, I think the lion's share of government funding and the lion's share of philanthropy is going to post-secondary. And I feel like at that point, it's almost too late. I feel like we're missing out on a huge number of students that could be the next Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or Toby Lutke or whoever, or scientists and engineers and doctors, and not just those folks, but
Mm-hmm.
creating economic opportunity and social progress and innovation benefiting sectors. But we're I think we're only focusing our investments and our sparks to those who may have already largely made it and been supported. So I feel like there's a huge missing investment at that like middle school and high school level that provinces alone can't make up for.
And that just speaks to the short cycles of politics and people's lack of ability to think this won't bear fruit for 10 years. But by that time, election cycles and so forth have already passed. And so you don't see the direct benefit. So yeah, this requires people that have a little bit more of a long-term vision for that. And I want to shift a little bit more to you specifically. So first of all, I'm going to ask you, because I asked Jennifer this question too, and I'll see how you respond. When people ask you, what do you do, Michael? Do you identify yourself as an entrepreneur? Do you identify yourself as an activist? What do you? And that's just narrowing this question. You're a lot of things. I get it, but like I say, I'm an educator, just to keep it simple. But how do you identify yourself as?
Yeah, I guess I would probably use the term social innovator. I think that while I identify with educator as well, I think social innovator is all encompassing.
Sure.
And I think that my passion is how can we apply innovation and particularly like a technology driven approach to addressing social issues. And education is a kind of key focus for that. But it's also more broadly also carrying forward and passing forward that torch of kind of youth civic participation was a big focus of ours as students, and now helping to cultivate and support and encourage that next generation of change makers in ways that we wish we had been able to be supported and encouraged.
What is Taking It Global?
So Taking It Global has evolved. It began when we had this vision in 1999. It began as a social network for social good. It began as an idea to create an online community connecting young people around the precursor to the SDGs, which was the United Nations Millennium Development Goals back in 2000, 8 goals to eliminate the world's problems by 2015. And we definitely made some progress. But as the internet was coming into being, I thought, wouldn't it be powerful and wouldn't it be interesting as a student to be learning about these issues, not just through a textbook, but by connecting with and understanding people and places that we're learning about. And so when we created the organization, we started with volunteers, students like us in about 30 countries. And we built all of these online community features and tools and a platform for teachers to also create cross-cultural exchange. So we kind of evolved from this digital platform, social network, before Facebook and Friendster, but no advertising and non-commercials. And as a charity, obviously, we didn't commercially exploit it, but we grew from that to really an organization, a charity that designs and delivers youth engagement programs in 3 areas. So focusing on youth leadership and social innovation, creating connected learning experiences, and I know you chatted with Jennifer a bit about Connected North, and then also fostering creativity and digital skills. So we went from just like this kind of website online community to now more of, I would say in some ways, an incubator for ideas. And I think the thing that's unique about us as an organization is I don't think we aspire to be this massive youth serving organization. Like the YMCA was our incubator when we first started, YMCA Greater Toronto. We took over their computer lab that was unfunded in exchange for free office space. And the thing that amazed me, I had no idea, the YMCA in Toronto alone is over $100 million a year organization. They run government programs, daycare. It's not just a gym. Some people think of the Y as a gym, but they have grown to run all kinds of programs for governments and things like that. For us, I thought that's interesting, but I think what always excited us is the systems change. If we can demonstrate possibility and then we can infuse or infect, some people use the idea virus, and that was an article about us in Fast Company back when that magazine was an inch thick and the top of the dot-com boom. But if we can show a system what's possible and then give the idea over to the system, will run it for us, and it'll be a lot more sustainable than us doing that ourselves. So in our history, there's been a few examples like that where we've built and scaled an initiative and then given it to the public or another organization or a government, and they've created more opportunity for it. And then we can move on to the next idea, the next innovation, or we can make a difference. And Creative Commons open source is a big part of that too. So all the education resources we might touch on or talk about, everything we publish and create is intended to be openly used and shared and built on.
I mean, as somebody who's been, again, I continue to applaud the fact that you've been able to do this for as long as you have, because it's
Survive.
not
A lot of
normal.
charities don't even make it 5 years, 10 years. Yeah.
Yes, no, 100%. But I wonder if is there an origin story for you in terms of whether it was a light bulb moment or an experience that you had in your youth before this, that sort of you feel like, yeah, that was a seminal moment in terms of what I decided I wanted to spend my career doing.
No, I'm just kidding. No, of course. No, I definitely. I feel bad.
No, listen, that's a fair answer. Like, I would have loved it if that would have been
No,
your
no, no.
answer.
No, I have
No,
to
there's
say,
no.
I was just teasing, but yeah, I give a lot of credit. It's funny, how far do we want to go back? I think it really begins, and you probably heard this story, I think, a few times, but I share that my dad bought me a Commodore 64 when I was 2. And so
Sure.
I was privileged to have that experience of getting access to technology, but it was more than that. I think it was really the blurring between consumer and creator, right? Because I loved playing games on that computer and these Fisher Price games they used to have. But he also taught me basic programming at, I forget, maybe a couple years later when I was 5 or 6 or 7. And the like line 10, line 20, how tedious it was back then. Now we're like vibe coding entire websites in as long as it would have taken to just write out a couple line program. But I think that early experience with that possibility that was demonstrated by that technology, that Commodore 64, that screen that you could put whatever you wanted into and make infinite ideas, that led to, in middle school, bulletin board systems. I got my own phone line in grade 6, and all of a sudden people could call. It was like the internet with two people almost, but people could call and you could play a game together. And online community, the beginning of online community. And I was lucky to have a grade 5 teacher, Miss G, Norma G, who I've stayed in touch with a little over the years, lives in Collingwood now in her retirement. She was brought in the first robotics set. And even though I wasn't in her class, she was in a gifted class, had a gifted class, didn't teach me. She brought me in and showed me the robotics set and always encouraged the things I was doing. And so I think it was like those experiences of being able to create things in a safe space that then led me in high school to start a website inspired by the guys at Yahoo that had started their website in university. I thought, well, if these university students could figure this out. I think that's one of the reasons why we've been so committed to open source and Creative Commons is even today, you can go to Microsoft.com and click on view source and see how their website is built. And so back then, the cool thing at the beginning of the World Wide Web is like anyone could just copy and paste and edit. And so I created a website with some friends at the beginning of the internet days, back in the AOL kind of CompuServe days, that became, by the time I was in grade 11, one of the most trafficked websites about technology. It was then called mydesktop.com. And we had about 1 million monthly readers, or 7 million monthly like pages read. And it was bigger than like the magazines that I was used to getting at the library. PC World magazine back then, we got our first advertisers by going to the library, getting the magazine and saying, oh, Intel, great, do you want to advertise on our website? Microsoft. And it was really my grade 7 grammar teacher, Miss Tierney, that was how I survived, because even though we were only 13, 14, 15, 16, I could write a professional email. Back then, no one really cared. It was like, if you could make a compelling pitch, you could do it. So I think, to me, like, those were some of the seminal experiences. And today, I think the risk that we run of social media being so addictive is that everyone is a consumer. But how do you flip that switch and make sure that they're also creators first, right? Or creators as well. I think about my own son who's 13, right? Like, he loves consuming content, but how do you ensure that we're participating in creating and understanding how these technologies work and not just mindlessly doom scrolling, as they say?
But that story makes me think, oh, you were on a trajectory to be the next, I don't know, the next Zuckerberg or Mark Cuban or whomever could have made a fortune knowing what you knew back then and selling what you were able to sell and all of that. So at some point though in this journey, it was like, actually, I don't want to, yes, I could maybe pursue
Your actual
a
question.
big
I know I got
sort of a
all the
wealth
way
of
up to your
perspective.
question. Yeah. And I think it was two things. So
Yeah.
one,
But it's part of the story. So you did that, but then at some point it was like, oh, but I could have a different purpose or a different focus with this work. So there's probably another story there that maybe there isn't.
You're right. No,
You could
there
say
is.
no
There is.
again.
And actually, where that story kind of ends is that after doing all that, and we ended up selling the company when I was in grade 12, and there was a lot of media attention because this was 1999, before the people who made a lot more money. We sold it for a
Right.
couple
The
million,
bubble.
but people sold billion-dollar companies after that. But it was still, we were on the cover of the Globe and Mail, and there was these big story about three teens that didn't even have a proper desk. We had a patio table from Home Depot. They loved coming in and like filming that. So I started getting invited to speak at conferences and events. And one of my mentors back then, Don Tapscott, invited me to a conference called the Business Council down in Florida. And the thing that was exciting about that conference was that Bill Gates was speaking right after. And I'd always thought a lot about Bill Gates and was motivated and excited to meet him. And one of the things that intrigued me meeting him was that at that time, he was more excited about his philanthropy and more excited about the Millennium Goals and these social issues. And at the same time, Jennifer was named to the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. And so I got to join her to attend Davos, and met a lot of, and we were also invited that same year to speak at TED, the TED conference back when it was in California. So met Sergey and Larry before they started, as they were starting Google, got to meet a lot of folks who were seeing huge success way beyond what we were had access to or exposed. And the thing that struck me was, even with all their wealth and success that they already had at that young age, they were more interested in social issues and global issues. And so I thought, why can't I just work on that now? Technology, I think, offers so much opportunity to address those issues. I don't really like, and they weren't happier. If anything, they were, not to say tortured, but like they were more excited, more enthusiastic, having created some really cool tech projects like with Bill Gates and making a social impact. And so I thought, maybe I can just jump and do that now. I don't really need to go and make tens of millions or billions of dollars. I think my skills are needed in this sector now. And even today, the nonprofit and charitable sector has scarce technology resources dedicated to its success and survival. And I think we need more than ever, given how the issues that we're trying to address are bigger than ever, and the forces we're up against in terms of, like you talked about, social media addiction and mental health issues and education, competitiveness globally. They need a strong nonprofit sector that has the best tools at its disposal.
So, as an entrepreneur over those 20 years, I'm sure you've had sort of those moments, eureka moments, when the funding's been there, or an impact has been made but also it's tough, right? You're battling. There's times where it's, gee whiz, where are we gonna, how's this next project gonna sustain itself and so forth. So can you just, again, because I like to focus on the notion of leadership in the show, maybe share a story of something that was like a setback that really put you back on your heels, but somehow, again, you've been able to overcome, obviously, in this time. So is there a story that kind of comes to mind that helps tell that?
Yeah, and it's funny because even thinking back about learning how to code at a young age, and my first software program I was so excited to build was a tracker for sports cards. I always had like big baseball, Toronto Blue Jays fan, always had like cards in a mess in the house. My mom was always yelling me to clean them up. And I created a piece of software that let people organize their sports cards collection. And I went all over the Etobicoke, where I grew up in West End of Toronto, and like put up these flyers, people to call and buy it. And I never got one phone call to buy our software. So even from the beginning, there was a quote from Thomas Edison: "I haven't failed. I found 10,000 ways that don't work." And that always resonated with me because it's about, I think, learning quickly and moving on. And that's one of the things, one of our strong partnerships is with Amazon. And I know there's a similar Jeff Bezos quote about, I'm always trying to encourage people to go faster, even if it means making mistakes, because the cost of trying to avoid them is huge in terms of speed. For us as an organization, imagine back in 2000 starting a charity. I thought a charity would be a lot easier to fundraise for than a for-profit that I had getting venture capital. But there weren't any programs, there weren't foundations, governments didn't have funding programs for the internet. So we got turned down quite a lot in our early years for funding because people thought it was too ambitious or didn't understand what we were talking about in terms of connecting people virtually and remotely. And so one of the things that led to, though, was us building our own technology and selling that technology platform to other nonprofits and charities, even to governments, even to companies. Microsoft at one point licensed one of our technology platforms, one of their programs. So that early rejection led us to make an early decision to build our own technology platforms. We were one of the first multilingual websites on the internet back when database engines could barely support multiple languages. We were the best youth website in Russia in 2004. We had Cyrillic and Arabic right to left. So that initial rejection led us to develop technology that ended up becoming a revenue source for our R&D and for our program development. And even today, we still do a limited amount of that. We have several strategic partners like the government of Nunavut, where we build education platforms, learning platforms for our own programs, and we also license them to our partners to help make their programming more efficient. But it really sucked to get those
So if you were to, yeah, no, but I think again, there's no way you could be in this role doing this work for 25 years without being pretty resilient. That's just something that you have to endure. And so again, I just think there's so many good lessons there. And I'll get to I want to get to a question about advice in a second, but before I do, I just want to see. So I know you've had, if you look up, and I'll full disclosure. So Michael, you and I have known each other for a long time, but I don't know all the things you did. So I just asked ChatGPT. I said, I'm going to interview Michael Furdyk for my podcast. Help me prep for this interview by giving me a briefing on his work, particularly with Taking It Global. So then it gave me like some of the stuff I knew, but there's like, oh man, there's a lot here.
Hopefully it didn't.
So what is your highlight reel? Yeah, there's some things here. Like, I don't know that it hallucinates because, again, now it does provide me the links to the sources where which is really helpful. But when you think about the highlights, and I'll compare with what I have with what you share. If you were going to do a highlight reel of these last 25 years or beyond, you go early, what three sort of moments would just be like, and you may have touched on some of them already, but maybe not, would make that highlight reel for you?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, they're starting at the very past. I think that opportunity that we created for young people, especially in the LDCs, least developed countries, around the WSIS conference, the fact that we got that paragraph, as trivial as it seems, like a paragraph in a declaration, but that work that the Youth Caucus did back then played a huge role in creating funding opportunities for a lot of young people in developing countries to lead and expand initiatives that have leveraged technology to provide employment and entrepreneurship opportunities to youth. There's a beautiful documentary that was made of that work 20 years ago that I'll send you the link to so you can put it in the show notes, because it's a really fun look at what did that actually look like. And one of the things that happened there was that we funded, and we're not talking about like millions of dollars, a couple $1,000s a piece, information society youth campaigns for young people across those regions to run conferences and events and talk about why is technology important for the, and I know it sounds like comical today, like of course technology and the internet, but 22 years ago, and I got to visit Ghana. I stayed in the village with a young person from Ghana and attended a conference. People traveled days to attend this event at an internet cafe called Busy Internet in Accra, where they learned about like why building technology skills is going to help you in the future. And so that work around the WSIS Youth Caucus, I would say, is number one in terms of the opportunities that it created for young people all around the world to have a better, more sustainable livelihood because of tech. I would say the second one actually fast forwards almost all the way to the pandemic. When COVID hit, our Connected North program, which served back then 50 schools, was essentially shut down overnight with schools closing. And our team thought a lot about what could we do to add value in this day and age with what's happening with young people being stuck at home. And there were two parts to that. One, how do we better advocate for digital equity? Because you have students in Toronto where the TDSB and Rogers partnered seemingly overnight, thanks to Peter Singh's leadership, and essentially were able to deploy devices and internet to every student that needed them within a few weeks. And then in Nunavut, you had teachers going door to door, handing photocopied sheets out. There was not, the connectivity wasn't there, and the hardware, the laptops, devices were not there, not available. So imagine the inequity of learning opportunities and learning loss for those students in the North. So first of all, I was proud that we spoke up at a government event looking at how this was going to impact children and youth. And that led to us getting funding that ended in March, sadly, but funding that where we distributed over 3,000 laptops, digital inclusion grants, preloaded with tons of learning content featuring Indigenous role models to grade 11 and 12 students in the communities we serve. So that was a huge highlight. But then, really, kudos to our team. We launched two initiatives, firesidechats.ca and create2learn.ca, that created on demand, open, Creative Commons, free learning resources for any school, any educator across Canada that address career pathways with fireside chats and really offer digital skills, almost like a masterclass type website around digital skills, entrepreneurship, digital innovation for young people. So I'm really proud of the work that our team did and that I helped to spark to create resources and to get technology in the hands of young people in the most remote communities of Canada during that time. And the third thing is Your Voice is Power. And this is a program that was created in the United States by Georgia Tech University, Pharrell Williams and his foundation Yellow, and Amazon Future Engineer. And the idea was to engage all students in coding by giving them a hook that they could all care about and relate to, which is music. And I had the opportunity to spend 2 years teaching an after-school program in the TDSB at St. Stephen's House for students that needed that last credit to complete. And I remember the way I did it, and the reason I was successful, because I had to teach web design to students that didn't really want to finish school. But the hook was, what do you care about? Let's build a website about that. And so when I heard about this program in the US, I thought this would be a fantastic way to engage students across Canada in coding, but also in addition to what Pharrell did, which was his song Entrepreneur, that was inspiring young Black youth to consider entrepreneurship, we collaborated now with 5 Indigenous artists in Canada, including Asinabi, who won the Juno, Dakota Bear, J. Lee Wolf, Twin Flames, Elder Dr. Duke Redbird, a spoken word poet, and others, to create this program that infuses music, coding, and also social justice and truth and reconciliation. So that, and we've just launched the new AI learning module. So I would say those would be the 3 highlights: the WSIS Youth Caucus, the pandemic response, and Your Voice is Power.
I mean, it also it speaks to your humility, because there's a lot of other highlights that are a little more focused on you, whether it's speaking at TED or Oprah Winfrey, or even some of the businesses and things that you've sold over the time. But again, you're pointing to the collective work that you and your team have done. So I think that speaks volumes to you as well. So 3 is tough, but we probably could have got more. I know that. Again, just very impressed. But I was going to ask you about this idea of what advice would you give to young people now? And again, thinking back, I mean, number one, acknowledging whatever privilege, opportunities that you had, the time that you were living in, which are all parts of making you obviously who you are and what you've been able to do. But for the young person that says, I love what you've done, right? Because I think we have young people that are much more socially aware than probably, certainly when I grew up, and probably even when you grew up. There's people that actually want to do this kind of work, but just can't maybe figure out how could I even do this? What advice do you give to those young people who see the end of what you've done, can't fathom how to get there, but really do want to get there?
I think there's 2 things. And just thinking about the conference I went to in Geneva, it was a dual conference. It was the World Summit on the Information Society, and it was also AI for Good, which is the UN's annual conference about AI. And that conference was entirely free. Anyone could sign up and register. You had parents bringing their kids, you had young people coming from all over the world. When we attended our first conference 20 years ago, we had no budget. We had no money. We scraped together enough to buy a plane ticket, stayed in a hostel. I was remembering not even having a bathroom. The food was, even today, was expensive. Back then, I can only imagine. Like, I remember government folks being part of the delegation having a per diem. I didn't know what a per diem was. All I knew is that even McDonald's was a lot more expensive than in Canada. So I would say look for opportunities, conferences and events you can attend somewhere else that are free, because there's tons of them. And so that opportunity to expose yourself to different ideas and perspectives, if you can just fundraise enough, find funding to get a plane ticket, or ask someone that you that travels a lot to donate points to go on a trip. But that experience of attending one of these summits or events, and there's probably, for any of us in Canada too, there's probably regional events in our own backyards. It doesn't have to be halfway around the world. But I would say first, exposing yourself to conferences and events, networks. Almost every city has networks of people working on similar things or open to sharing, and they're eager to mentor and engage with young people. The Internet Society, for example, was there. IEEE, the Engineering Society, was there. I know they have chapters in cities and communities all over the world. So trying to get to one of those events. And if you can't travel, if there's no, many of them are also live streamed. There's so much free content out there. This AI for Good conference had everything, again, live streamed online for free. And that becomes something you can put on your LinkedIn, put on your resume. You participated, you did something, you sharing what you learned, and then talking about your experience will unlock more experiences. I think people want to find interesting people to invite to their conferences, to invite to their circles. There's a huge momentum right now around youth participation. And so for young people today, putting yourself and your interests out there on networks like LinkedIn or Twitter, now X, people will find you. The other thing I would say around entrepreneurship is how the barriers have continued to drop in terms of being able to turn an idea into action. It used to be that you had to apply for venture capital and raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to actually build a company or build an idea. And I'm sure many of you, if you haven't yet heard about it, you will soon hear the term vibe code. Using AI, you can essentially just have a conversation and build a product. So I think if you have an idea, you can build a prototype. You can build, they talk about MVP, minimum viable product, that you can launch to your friends, launch in your community. I mean, truly anyone can code today with AI. You can literally have a conversation with platforms like Replit, and there's dozens out there. If you just Google vibe coding resources, there's a number of leaders in the space. And in fact, there's entire new books. I'll send you a link to a new book to put in your chat for educators around. We just had a code to learn workshop about a new vibe coding and education book. So I would say expose yourself to unique learning opportunities, ideally in person or virtually if not, and then build something, even if it's a flop, even if it's a failure. Prototyping, building ideas, being able to talk about how you did that will unlock more opportunities as well. But the barriers have never been lower. And I'll never forget something I heard a speaker say that now I'm feeling in the same way. The one asset you have as a young person, whether you're 25, you said, or 15, is that you have time. You probably don't yet have a mortgage or kids or people depending on you. So you can try and fail a lot, as much as possible, before you're 30, before you're 35 or 40, and you have these responsibilities, because that will lead you in interesting directions. It'll lead you to learning experiences. And that's why I think like Peter Thiel funds his Thiel Fellowship, $100,000 to drop out of school for high promise young people, because he thinks that building something will be much more valuable than sitting in a classroom. So I would say learning experiences, events, communities, finding communities, and build something. Even if you don't want to learn code long term, you can just talk to one of these AI models and create something.
And what that makes me think about is, and going back to what we talked about earlier, but this idea that at a young age, people can do a lot more than, and I think about going back 15 years when the whole idea of blogging became a thing. And it's like you're saying, like now anybody can blog, anybody can share stuff. And those tools have only gotten better. Like when you talk about vibe coding and other opportunities for kids to build. But the thing that is missing, and this is what we talked about earlier, is that K-12 environments are not advocating enough for kids to take advantage of this. And so the stories that emerge right now are the kid that's sitting at home figuring this out themselves, which is great. But why can't schools be more a part of encouraging this kind of entrepreneurship and exploration, with having trusted, caring adults around them to support them, as opposed to kids that maybe have a parent that's like you had that kind of supported and encouraged you? That's great, but that's not very equitable.
Yeah.
And yet we have this opportunity today to give kids that, who, again, I think about tapping into this activism mindset that so many youth have, to want to do good. But how do I do how do I do good things in the world? here's some opportunities that you probably maybe don't know about or can't access to. So I think about that. And I know, Michael, that your work is largely focused on, that kind of idea, putting that more in the hands of our students and our teachers. But I don't know. I just want to leave that there just to see if you want to add to that, just because I think that's such an important point to think about, how our schools can get better at advocating and supporting for kids to do the right and do good work using these powerful technologies.
Yeah, actually, one highlight I didn't include is that we launched before the pandemic a grant program called Rising Youth, and that put 7,000 micro grants in the hands of students and youth over 5 years. And I imagine, and one of the reasons we took it on was I imagine every student in their educational experience getting a small grant and launching and leading a project. And imagine the change that would create in our communities, but also in that mindset. For us, that rejection, those first few grants that were rejected really sucked. But once we got our first approval, the encouragement and the positive reinforcement that provided was huge. And I think if we could give every high school student in Canada a micro grant and have a course where they actually launch a project. The new grade 9 and 10 tech and skilled trades curriculum in Ontario is great because students have to create a project. But imagine if they actually got funding, and imagine if that project could actually, and part of the assessment was the real world impact it had on their community. Just like everyone knows about high quality project based learning and education, the authentic audience is really important. So I think it is and would be really important to create those opportunities. And I know in Ontario, we used to have these speak up student voice grants that did something similar. But I think we could see a huge amount of accelerated learning if we gave students some space and challenged them to use all these skills that they're using outside of school in school. And it reminds me of this quote from this Partnership for 21st Century Skills report. It seems like forever ago. I think it was also around the year 2000, where they said the education system faces irrelevance unless we bridge the gap between how students live and how they learn. And I still think that there's work to be done there in terms of this even more immersive, and I'm not saying it's positive, but the immersive use of technology outside of school, and then like phones away, back to basics focus in some provinces in the school system. I think I worry about how those students are going to compete. Our students in Canada are going to compete with students in these countries that I've heard of last week, where they're embracing these technologies and integrating them into everything in that K-12 system. So I think we need more leadership, and I think we need more collaboration, because our resources are going to be scattered if we approach this in such a siloed district by district, province by province methodology.
And in the end, it's an equity issue as well, right? The kids that have access and have support outside of school can do all these really amazing things. The tools are right there in front of them, and the kids that say, I don't even know what that is, are left behind. So,
And I think that actually,
so last question, then
I asked, well,
yeah,
one
go
last
ahead.
thing, which is someone said, what's the one thing you would change in education? And I said, putting more resources in the hands of teachers. I think what's key to what you just described is more fund, more resources and more professional learning at the level of the individual teacher. Because I think right now there's a lot of decisions being made levels above the individual teacher, and there's a lot of resources we're like buying and investing in that don't trickle down. And so I think it's important to give teachers more space and time to explore and to develop these skills themselves. And our new AI learning lesson is as much for teachers as it is for students. So I think providing that professional respect and that space and that investment so that teachers can bring those ideas into the classroom. I think there's so much currently being crammed into the limited PD time that it's not as available as it could be for them to have these learning journeys and them to
For
feel
sure.
inspired
Yeah.
and prepared.
100%. Again, I think the messaging, having spent the last couple of weeks talking with a lot of different superintendents and so forth from every province is, oh, our budgets are cut or whatever. And so how do, this big question is, how do we get governments to invest more money into schools? I think one of the things is messaging them that just forget the moral imperative around this. Just say, you economically, this will be better if you invest with these kids, because they will be the next kids. And it may not even take you 10 years. Like I said before, like sometimes it's like, oh, we invest in these kids and we don't see the returns on it. The speed at which things are moving today, it's quite possible that an investment today will bear return
Much more.
a lot more quickly than it did, before. So
Yeah.
I think there's a need for people like yourselves, and I would put myself in there to continue to advocate and help frame this issue, not as, again, I'm happy to pursue it from a moral perspective, but I also think there's an economic value here that if government said, oh, gee whiz, if we invested more in teachers and these students can quickly become leaders in this space, there's,
Not years. The technology, yeah, you can onboard in months, not years, some of these tools.
yeah, no, that's fantastic. All right, one more question, then we'll kind of hit you with some quick ones to get you out here. I always like to people be a little bit show some gratitude, if you will. And I know this is a difficult question. You actually touched on a few people early on in your life that you're grateful for. So if you had to name one person in education specifically, so maybe outside of the entrepreneurial space, but I'm thinking more in education, who you're grateful for. And again, I know there's lots of people, so when you say one person, you're not excluding other people that would be part of that list, but just somebody that's maybe come to mind of late, or something that you're thinking about that you're really grateful for in the education space.
I think the person I'll give a shout out to here is Gary Steger. He's both done a lot of work to promote the teachings and the philosophies of Seymour Papert, who's the father of educational computing for youth, and his site Daily Papert. He personally brought my attention to Seymour's work and to a lot of the leading thoughts and work that he did, but also in his publishing work and the book Invent to Learn, but also many other books that have followed suit that have inspired and that we've connected teachers to that same idea. We talk about code to learn, create to learn, but even at a higher level, invent to learn. How do we encourage students to invent new possibilities? So definitely check out Gary's work and the Daily Papert site that he runs.
I'm always excited when people share somebody that I also concur. And Gary's been an advocate for so many positive changes. And I think in the end, what always shines through with Gary is his true love for children, that he really wants to do right by kids. And so that's very evident in the work he's done. So
and not being afraid to challenge the status quo or challenge the power in tech and whatever.
We need more people like that in Canada to stand up and say, let's start doing that one. You have to put yourself in some difficult situations sometimes, and you're not always popular because you don't necessarily want the status quo to continue. No, Gary is such a good example of that. All right, 3 quick questions to get you out. You already tossed a couple of books my way, but professionally, what are you reading and or listening to, however you consume? So what's your professional learning look like these days?
Well, I'll share 2, because one is more professional, one's less professional. One that I really enjoyed recently is called Frostbite, and it is about the history of refrigeration, which is just fascinating to reflect on how just 100 years ago, refrigeration wasn't really that much of a thing. And now all of a sudden we take food systems and food supply for granted. The other one, a little bit more professionally, is called Material World. I'm about a third of the way through the audiobook, and it's looking at different materials that, again, we take for granted. I'm on the chapter about sand and glass and how it's such a part of the internet, for example, with fiber optics and things that we don't often think about. So those are 2 really interesting ones, Frostbite and Material World.
Those both remind me of, there was a podcast, and it was I think short-lived. There's maybe 20 episodes called Surprisingly Awesome. And the premise of the show was to take something that seemed on its surface boring, but prove to people why it's awesome. So refrigeration might be one of those things. But now that you've said it, it's like I can totally understand why that would be a very fascinating, interesting topic. So I'm now curious to read about because I like those kind of things that seemingly seem, we see them every day, we don't think about them, but like when you lift the hood and you go, wow,
people used to deliver ice blocks. It used to be a luxury to have a cold drink or ice cream. Wow. Now.
Oh yeah. No, it's fascinating. All right. You were such a busy person, moving and traveling and working, but I have to believe there's got to be time for you just to unwind and not try to change the world constantly. So do you have like just a, whatever, it could be a guilty pleasure. Maybe it's not even guilty pleasure. Maybe it's just, I just like watching this. Do you have any consumption that's more on the just chill and a little bit more on the mindless side of things?
One series that I'm enjoying right now on Apple TV is called Murderbot. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's about like a robot that they think is like just defending them, but actually has sentience and actually knows what it's doing. I haven't watched the series finale yet, but that was great. And then on YouTube, I also enjoy Last Week Tonight, of course, and Mentor Pilot. I'm interested in aviation, and so Mentor Pilot's a fun channel where they break down all kinds of different facts and behind the scenes in the aviation industry.
See, you're all those ones though. You're still trying to learn though, Michael. Like you're still always learning. So
That's really true. Okay,
that's okay. I'm just
also watching The Studio on Apple TV, which is a little more on the silly side, but Seth Rogen
okay.
as the head of a film. So there's like the least professionally relevant one.
Good for you. All right. Last question to get you out of here is I always want to know. So I believe you're a Toronto boy. That's where home is. Toronto's a great city, whatever. People rave about lots of things, but lots of things are easy to Google and find out, like, oh yeah, whatever, CN Tower, Hockey Hall of Fame, whatever. Lots of things happening there. Give us some insider, whether it's a restaurant, a park, a facility, someplace that like most people, you might not know, but like you should go there and check this out. It's really cool. What is that place?
It's tough with Toronto, but I would say a favorite of mine, and tons of people love going to Center Island, take the ferry, and it's packed in the summer. But one like slightly lesser known secret is that you can kayak there. And if you like kayaking or boating, I love kayaking. You can rent a kayak, you can skip the lines, you can have a much more relaxed experience, and you can even pull up on shore and go for a swim. There's some clean beaches. So one of my favorite kind of things is to just walk down to the waterfront. I live nearby, and instead of fighting the hordes of people on boats, you can kayak and paddle over to the island.
That's a good one. I've been to Center Island once, I think so, but I have not gone kayaking there. So that seems like a cool
There's
thing.
also a secret windsurfing spot too. If you're up to look to learn a new sport, you can windsurf off of Cherry Beach, and there's a great school that teaches. I've only done it once, but it was a lot of fun. If it's a windy day, you can pick up a new skill. Less busy than
Michael, this has been a pleasure just to talk with you. And again, I just want to speak as an admirer of your work and your efforts. And you and Jennifer have done just amazing work. And I know you're continuing to do that one. And I'm always excited anytime I could talk with you or partner with you in any ways. Thank you so much for your time today. I know you're a busy guy, but I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. It's an honor to be involved, and I appreciate you creating the space and profile for stories like ours to have an audience.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.